Good to have your company. You're watching Round Table. President Emmanuel Macron says it's France's role to be, as he puts it, a mediating power between Russia and Ukraine to end the conflict, and that France will continue to have ties and possible discussions with Russia. But his approach has been criticized by some Eastern European nations who see it as undermining efforts to force Putin to the negotiating table. During Macron's almost 100 hours of phone calls to the Russian president, Putin said he would rather play ice hockey than hold peace talks. So will Macron be the man that brokers a Russia-Ukraine peace deal? Very good to have you along. I'm David Foster. The French president has put himself forward as the leading voice for a negotiated end to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. A conflict that he says must not humiliate Putin. A remark criticized by Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmitry Kuleba, who said calls to avoid humiliation of Russia can only humiliate France, and that his country had a different plan to put Russia in its place. Despite their many phone calls, Putin maintains what he told Macron in March, that Russia will achieve its military objectives whatever happens, including the demilitarization of Ukraine. So do Ukraine and Russia really want French intervention? Let's go first of all to Paris, and Jean-Christophe Bart awaits us there, Chief Exec of the Connectors of Peace think tank, and with me in the studio, Keir Giles, Senior Consulting Fellow at the Russia and Eurasia Programme, Chatham House. Jean-Christophe, let me ask you this first of all. Very close to President Putin, what did we say? More than 100 hours of phone calls from Emmanuel Macron. Is he being a fool, or is he just playing the right sort of game?
Well, it depends from what angle or what perspective you look at this willingness to keep the link open with Moscow. And, I'm not here to defend or to justify what Mr. Macron has been doing, but I think he was acting not just as the president of France, but also as the president of the European Council, and in a way, his role and responsibility was to keep some connection and conversation open with the belligerent. And I don't think there was any sort of complacency, any sort of willingness to engage in a sympathetic way with President Putin. It was just, a way to try to keep the connection open, and also, to think about the future. Whatever happens, we will not change the geography of Europe. And whatever will be the end of this war, Russia will still be our neighbor, and we will have to cope with the Russian neighbor.
Why did he say, or was quoted as saying, that the West must not humiliate Russia, or rather Putin mustn't humiliate the man himself?
Well, again, I'm not the spokesperson of President Macron, and but. I think, we should not let ourselves, get lost in sort of a semantic dispute. The sense of this phrase was probably to say that if a man, particularly like President Putin, is losing his face, he might become even more let's say, like acting like barbarism. And so we should try by all means, to keep the possibility of sort of an exit strategy. And evidently, if Putin is losing face, it will be even more difficult. I think, as I said before, we are in a way losing ourselves in a sort of a semantic dispute.
But that wasn't the feeling of those Eastern European countries who felt that they perhaps were much more in the firing line than France, etc., etc. And to say you mustn't humiliate Putin was outrageous. They're furious about the comment. So it's not a semantic detail to them.
It is not a semantic detail to them. I can easily understand. And I'm not sure, this was the proper word to use. I mean, to say we should not humiliate Putin. I think it would have been probably more appropriate to say that we need to preserve the chance of looking at what will happen next. And I think the reality is, in a way, that we are in a deadlock. We have been in this terrible tragedy and war for the past 4 to 5 months, and there is absolutely no plan on the table to come up with any sort of peace agreement or any sort of settlement. What I see and what everyone can see and hear is that President Zelensky himself made a very strong call just a few days ago to reach a peace agreement by the end of this year. And also that the President Biden himself had some sort of an ambiguous phrase and by saying that we should start thinking of some sort of a settlement of the dispute, and saying in sort of half words that we will probably never recover some part of the Ukrainian territory. So I think it's quite important to start thinking about the future.
Okay. Keir, I want to bring you in at this particular point, and I'm also not President Macron's spokesman, so when I say it does make some kind of sense not to wish to gloat, to rub somebody's face in it, to grind them into the dirt, in other words, humiliate them, if at some point in the future you have to deal with them.
There is a point in that, but after all, let's look at the other side of it. Now, Jean-Christophe just said that the purpose of not humiliating Putin was that he did not resort to barbarism, but what else would you call Russia's current conduct in the war? How much worse can it get? And if you do not emphasize to President Putin that he has lost the war and suffered a defeat, what possible deterrent is there in the future for him launching another war later on down the track?
But there is a big difference between ignominy, in other words, understanding you've lost and that you look a bit of a fool, and total embarrassment, humiliation, isn't there?
I don't think it's quite such a big difference. But what there is a big difference between is what President Zelensky is looking for, which is a termination to the war which is actually sustainable, and what many European allies are actually calling for, which is a peace agreement, a negotiated settlement, which looks like surrender of Ukraine, which looks like trading, as they put it, territory for peace. The problem is, if you give up territory for Russia in return for a temporary respite from the fighting, not only does it show to Russia that these tactics they are using work, but also it gives Russia the breathing space that they need to reconstitute their armed forces, to rebuild their strength in order to relaunch the war at a later date.
Let me come in here and redirect us back towards President Emmanuel Macron of France. Is he playing a canny political game, in your opinion, or is he being naive, or what?
It's hard to imagine that after all this time, President Macron is still being naive. You have to think that there is something else behind it. But even in Russia, he is now becoming the subject of mockery, not only directly by President Putin, as we've seen in the transcripts of their conversations released recently, but there's even a new verb in the Russian language, Macronit, meaning to phone up constantly with nothing in particular to talk about. And we have to remember, this goes back far further than the launch of the invasion in February of this year. Back in March 2020, we were discussing with the French ambassador in charge of launching this dialogue with Russia, Pierre Vimont, about exactly what they sought to achieve. Pierre Vimont was doing a tour of European capitals, trying to sell this initiative of talking to Putin. And at every stop, he was being told, this is a terrible idea. It has never worked before. It will only encourage Putin. At the end of these conversations, when every single justification that France was putting forward for this dialogue with Putin had been demolished, he said, well, all we can do is hope. The problem is the rest of Europe thinks that hope is not a strategy, and instead you should have an evidence and reality-based policy for dealing with Putin and Russia.
Jean-Christophe, back with you in just a moment, but first we're going to hear from President Macron fairly recently.
Maintenant, il est clair.
Now it's clear that the aggression launched by Russia on Ukrainian soil has a goal: Ukraine's surrender. That's not a negotiation. So we will continue to sanction Russia. We will continue to support Ukraine and its people to obtain either a complete victory of Ukraine or the possibility of, under conditions chosen by the Ukrainian people, leading their own negotiations under their own conditions.
Keir, does he appear to be rowing back slightly from what some people have described as being Putin's poodle? By saying here, listen, hang on, the decisions will be made by the Ukrainian people. We will continue to sanction Russia. We will not surrender to them.
Those are encouraging noises. The trouble is, it's not the first time that we have heard them, whether from France or from Germany and other European allies as well. But we need to look at what is actually being done as well as what is being said when the Ukrainians are listening. And then sometimes you get quite a different picture. The underlying idea that you have from Germany, from France, from others, is that we have to look to the relationship with Russia as the determining factor for European security instead of treating Russia as the fundamental threat and challenge to Europe.
What is the feeling in France in general? And this is such a broad question. I appreciate it's difficult, Jean-Christophe, but what is the feeling across the country of what President Macron is doing in the name of La République?
Well, you know, Macron has been going through a very difficult time in the last few weeks, you know, with the parliament election where he has been you know, quite challenged by the French people, and he has lost, in a way, the majority in parliament. But that was mostly for, let's say, domestic reasons. And my impression, and I think it is also confirmed by surveys, is that there is quite a strong support for the way he has been handling the situation in the last few months, and very few people are blaming him for maintaining the link or the dialogue with President Putin. There is also, I think, a growing concern about the total lack of short-term or even mid-term perspective with this conflict. And in that respect, I feel that many people consider that it is indeed important, by all means, to support the Ukrainian forces, to provide armament, to provide support. And I think, you know, nobody will question that during this 6 months presidency of the EU by France, you know, the EU has provided, I think, more than 15 billion support in armament for the war in Ukraine. And
no, I get that, but what I'm wondering is whether, if you have, if you like, President Macron on one side suggesting certain things, we mustn't humiliate, etc., and on the other hand, you have different European countries saying we must arm Ukraine as quickly as possible, we must defeat Putin militarily, whether he has allowed a schism, a gap to develop in what appeared to be at the very beginning, European solidarity.
Yeah, but again, I think it's a matter of let's say, of language, and I have the absolute conviction that Macron is 100% on the side of Ukraine, and willing, by all means, you know, and I think his declaration at the end of the G7 summit, when he said, you know, Russia cannot and should not win this war, and we should keep on supporting Ukraine, I think is a clear evidence that he is certainly willing to support Ukraine by all means. But in the meanwhile, it is important, and I don't think he is the only one. You know, if you look at, or if you read, you know, the declaration from Henry Kissinger and a few others who are also saying, you know, we should, in the meanwhile, start thinking of what would be the exit strategy. How is it that we can start rebuilding and the relationship, and also, in a way, maintaining, because this is what it is about, is how do we preserve the world peace, you know, and try to avoid that this conflict would be escalating and would spread around and becoming a world conflict.
Okay. So Macron was not alone in advocating, if you like, this policy of softly, softly. Kissinger, I read the interview with him, very much the same sort of idea of what he wanted to do. But why did the UK, why did Germany, why did other countries feel that Macron was getting it wrong?
I think it's worth looking at this with a bit of perspective. Now, Jean-Christophe is absolutely right that Macron has support from people thinking it should keep a line open to Putin and look to the longer-term relationship. And he's not alone. You have people like Kissinger who have been following this line for some time, and Jens Plötner, the government advisor in Germany, for example, echoing much the same thought. But let's look at what this actually means. Would these people have had the same support for doing the same thing with Nazi Germany in 1939? Because that is exactly the situation we are in now. A major threat to European security, an aggressor state, an autocracy which seeks territorial dominion over its neighbors. Is that really the kind of country with which you want to be building this kind of relationship and taking this softly, softly approach?
But Macron is not suggesting, as perhaps other people did in the 1930s, that Ukraine is a country of which they know very little and whose people they know even less about.
But what he is doing is looking more to the relationship with the aggressor than with the victim. That's what lies behind all of these calls for the longer-term prospects of dealing with Russia, regardless of the fact that in many cases Russia is simply not the more significant partner in the relationship.
But does Macron's approach mean that Russia, no matter what eventually happens militarily, will come out of this feeling that it has won something in terms of the attitude of the Western world?
Russia already has won something in terms of that attitude. It has the Macrons, the Plotners, the Kissingers already on their side. And as time goes on, of course, it is going to be harder and harder for Ukraine to keep that support, even if only in words, from countries like France, because as the conflict continues, the costs, the economic costs and the human costs become more and more clear to other countries in Europe. That plays in Russia's favor. And the longer people continue to encourage Russia to look towards this longer-term future instead of short-term defeat, the more Russia will be keen to keep this conflict going in order to extract maximum benefit from it.
Jean-Christophe, I'm going to read out some words from Boris Johnson, UK Prime Minister, at a G7 summit, who was warning Macron that an attempt to settle the conflict in Ukraine now, in other words, as quickly as possible, and therefore there must be some give and take on the Russian side as well as the Ukrainian side. He said it will only cause enduring instability and give Mr. Putin license to manipulate both sovereign countries and international markets in perpetuity. Give the man an inch, he'll take a mile, was the suggestion. We don't give him an inch.
Well, I don't think that Macron has expressed his interest or willingness to stop the conflict as soon as possible. I think what he has expressed is indeed the need to think and to look at the future and in a way to start considering a few options. And even if they are not realistic at this stage, I don't think that we can blame him for at least willing to come up with a plan A, a plan B, or a plan C. And in that respect, I think it's a little bit ironic to see that there is so much sort of controversy against Macron. And again, I'm not his spokesperson, but so much controversy because after all, he has been the one in the last 4 to 5 years since he was elected as a president who has been consistently pushing and advocating and championing the idea of a European defense security. You know, he has been in a way preaching in the desert and you know, not much, there was not much support for this idea. And I think it is quite important, you know, really to start thinking about how Europe can become much stronger in order, in a way, to defend itself against the possible aggression from Russia.
Okay, but equally, you could argue that the reason Macron is making himself so visible in all of this, and I'll stay with you, Jean-Christophe, for a moment, but then to you, is because it is self-serving. He wants to be effectively the next leader of Europe. He would like to follow on from Angela Merkel, from Germany to France, and to him. to himself at the top of the tree. Fair comment?
Well, if you go a few years ago, I think it was 2018. There was a cover from the Time magazine that say, Macron is the next leader of Europe, and then there was a very short footnote and say, provided he managed to fix France, or he managed to lead his own country. And I think he's still in the same situation today. There is indeed some sort of either leadership or at least is one who is coming up with a real ambition for Europe. And I think this is, in a way, fair. Maybe he's not doing it in a proper way, but I think this would be probably one of the main lessons of the last 2 or 3 years, is that in a way Europe has been handling the COVID crisis, in the way Europe has been handling the risk of a major economic crisis. I think it is to put to the credit of those with Macron, and it is not just about Macron, who have been pushing for more EU integration, EU coordinated policy, EU response to those major challenges. And I think it's being blind, really, to ignore the need for Europe to strengthen its security capacity,
which to some extent it may well have done with the accession of the Nordic countries to NATO. And one of your specialities is, I think you read a book called Waking the Neighbour. Waking the Neighbour. You may care to mention that in just a moment, but following up from what Jean-Christophe has just said, if Macron becomes the de facto leader of Europe, and Russia looks and thinks this is what a united Europe looks like with this man at its head, what will that say about the future European-Russian relationship?
I think the problem there is that, as Jean-Christophe suggested just a moment ago, Macron might have the right intentions, but as Jean-Christophe said, he's not going about it in the right way. Unfortunately, that applies to every single topic that we've been talking about so far. It might be that he's not pushing for a rapid end to the conflict at Ukraine's expense, but that's certainly how it comes across to Eastern Europe. And pushing for Europe to defend itself is a misguided enterprise when in fact there is NATO as an organization which is supposed to take care of that, and any European initiative will simply distract from NATO's preparations to defend the continent. So all of these efforts actually work in the wrong direction. And it's not as though there isn't prior experience to learn from. How many times have we seen ceasefire agreements drafted in Moscow imposed on the victims of Russian aggression by Western powers, including, repeatedly, France, whether it's the ceasefire agreement in Georgia in 2008, the Minsk agreements in Ukraine, repeatedly, 2014 onwards, the Syria agreements, which in this case were the United States, but in each case allow Russia to do whatever they want because Western powers are more interested in ending the fighting than actually achieving a workable outcome in it. And that's precisely the danger that Ukraine faces today.
Conciliator, sensible politician, future European leader with the best intentions, or a man whose ideas could lead Europe down a very dangerous road, Jean-Christophe?
Well, I think it is also the beauty of Europe is that, you have leaders who express different sensitivity, who express different perspective. And I don't mean there's a sense of déjà vu here, but I'd like just to get back to, the war in Iraq, when France and Germany and a few other countries, express not just skepticism, but in a way some very strong reservation about the war in Iraq. And at that time, it was considered as not being loyal to the, to the Western community or to the Atlantic community. And in a way, we still, 20 years later, pay the price of this mess.
And you're saying this is hypocrisy for Macron to receive criticism when, in fact, the boot was on the other foot 25 years ago?
No, I mean, my point is just to say that it's good that we have also in the, among all those voices that are speaking out, is that we have people who are eventually more prudent and who are in a way less, I don't know what's the exact word, the warmongers. And I think it's important that we are all in the same page. And in a way, the recent summit, the NATO summit and the G7 summit have, I think, demonstrated that there was no split or no fracture among the Western community. There are eventually different approach.
If only we had time to talk about the expansion of NATO. We have run out of time. We'll get you back to talk about that, Keir Giles, on another occasion. Thank you very much indeed. And Jean-Christophe, many thanks. Time obviously goes far too quickly for me. The Iraq War, 19 years ago, not nearly a quarter of a century, as I suggested. That was Gulf War I. Apologies for getting my maths a little bit wrong there. From me, David Foster, from my two guests, thank you very much indeed, wherever you happen to be picking up this edition of Roundtable. We hope to have your company next time. Until then, goodbye.